Welcome to the Institute this afternoon. My name is James Hackett. I'm editor of the Military Balance here at IISS. I'm very pleased to welcome Mark White, Deputy Head of the Stabilisation Unit, who will, as you've all got from the invitation, speak on delivering the integrated approach in fragile and conflict-affected states. Assisting fragile and conflict-affected states is an increasing challenge for both national and non-governmental actors. These states are increasing in number, and the complexity of social, economic, developmental, governance and security challenges faced by many is deepening. There are additional problems that are transnational in scope, ranging from the activities of increasingly mobile armed groups to organised criminal activity, to healthcare crises and pandemics. Many of these crises and challenges are in turn interconnected, such that the effect of one exacerbates another. I think this places a premium on well-targeted and coordinated responses, both short and long-term, by international organisations, NGOs and groups of states, but also by individual nations themselves. So with the UK having in the 2010 National Security Strategy identified a stable global environment as vital to UK security, and perhaps a year before another NSS, but certainly a year before another SDSR, and in the wake of a number of other related policy documents, it's an opportune time to hear about the Stabilisation Unit's work on early warning, rapid crisis prevention and response, and upstream prevention, but particularly the integrated approach promoted by the Stabilisation Unit, and how effective that's been not just in delivering HMG's policy objectives, but also in terms of its impact abroad. And though we've welcomed Stabilisation Unit representatives to workshops and roundtables here at the Institute, this is the first formal discussion meeting with an SU speaker, so I'm very glad to welcome Mark here today. Mark, as I said, is Deputy Head of the SU, and before joining that, his career included field postings as the British Government's Regional Conflict Advisor for West Africa, and a number of other conflict and SSR-related positions within DFID. Mark will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have ample time for discussion. Mark, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, James. Good afternoon to everyone, and thanks very much for coming along for what hopefully will be quite an interesting discussion. So, as James mentioned there, I'm Deputy Head of the Stabilisation Unit, and I lead our conflict, stabilisation, security and justice and lessons expertise. For those of you who are not familiar with who we are and what we do, just very briefly, the Stabilisation Unit is an integrated civil-military operational unit that was designed to be agile and responsive and equipped to operate in high-risk and high-threat environments. We combine in-house expertise on conflict, stabilisation, security and justice with the ability to call upon a larger pool of civilian expertise for specialised, longer-term or larger-scale taskings. We ensure that lessons from practical experience are captured as best practice and used to inform both our own work, conflict pool work in the British Government, and wider delivery and support of the British Government's Building Stability Overseas strategy and efforts. And we're funded as a programme from the British Government's conflict pool, and we report jointly into the Foreign Office, DFID and the Ministry of Defence. I've been asked to talk to you today about three things. Firstly, I'll talk about the integrated approach, how it differs from the comprehensive approach and why that shift took place within the British Government and is beginning to take place in other bilateral and potentially multilateral bodies as well. Secondly, I'll talk about some of the institutional reforms and the shifts in approaches that have taken place within the British Government over the last few years, designed to try and enable that integrated approach, which doesn't always come naturally, and to assess some of the effectiveness of those therein. And thirdly and finally, I'll highlight some of the continued issues and challenges of delivering the integrated approach, both across governments, multilaterally, and within fragile and conflict-affected states in particular, and what might be done to overcome them if there's that political will to do so. And of course, throughout this, I'll draw upon case studies to illustrate the points made. So just a bit, really, first up in terms of context, the genesis of the comprehensive approach, as many of you will know, and hence then the integrated approach, lay in the quite complex civil-military arrangements made necessary by peace support operations in the Balkans during the 1990s, and they were further developed by the demands of the conflicts placed upon us in the 21st century in Iraq and Afghanistan. As with many issues in the British Government, however, I think the delivery architecture was some way ahead of some of the formal policy-making mechanisms. So following our experiences in the Balkans in the 1990s, and I think quite a demonstrable need for a more comprehensive civil-military approach to conflict challenges, our government at the time took steps to try and inform and improve cross-departmental working on conflict prevention, and established a tri-departmental Foreign Office, DFID and Ministry of Defence funding arrangement for conflict prevention, stabilisation and peacekeeping. So that led to the creation of the global conflict prevention pools and the Africa conflict prevention pools in 2001. I think there was recognition swiftly after that, to be frank, that joint funding alone was not going to be sufficient to guarantee effective civil-military and civil-civil cooperation, particularly in post-conflict environments. And as a result, the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Unit, a forerunner of the Stabilisation Unit, was established in 2004. And its role at the time was to facilitate cross-departmental assessment and planning, to develop and deploy civilian expertise, and to identify and learn lessons. So I think at that stage the policy community began engaging on these issues in earnest, sort of post-2004. And the comprehensive approach was initially developed, as many of you will be aware, within the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence produced a joint discussion note in about 2005-2006 called the Comprehensive Approach, and that was followed in 2007 by a joint doctrine note on countering irregular activity within a comprehensive approach. And then effectively the first Comprehensive Approach to Defence doctrine was published a year later in 2008. I think quite tellingly, however, there was no formal policy document agreed by all the relevant departments until the publication of the National Security Strategy in 2010 and the Building Overseas Strategy Stability Overseas Strategy in 2011. And I think those people who worked on both of those documents began to understand why the formal articulation of policy was quite so difficult. By which that time the comprehensive approach had been subtly replaced with the term the integrated approach to signify the closer nature of interdepartmental, interagency working that was aspired at the time. There was a House of Commons Defence Committee report into the comprehensive approach that recommended, and I quote, the MOD, the FCO and DFID working together with the Stabilisation Unit should produce a comprehensive approach policy and doctrine. Many ingredients for such a policy and doctrine already exist, but are not brought together in one place. And I think it's quite telling that to date, and I'll go on to elaborate on this, no such policy or doctrine has been published, although the Stabilisation Unit, through a series of various different practice papers and informal notes, we now have almost de facto guidance on the integrated approach without it being officially confirmed. So, what is the integrated approach, and how does it differ from the comprehensive approach? The underlying logic is common sense, really, in the sense that in the context of the Building Stability Overseas Strategy, the idea that one would engage in an integrated way is hard to dispute. It's recognition that in order to build stability, there's a need to bring together better diplomatic, development, defence and other national security tools to help resolve conflicts and contribute to stability. And as I mentioned, that shift from comprehensive to integrated is subtle but quite important. I think we've learned that over the past decade or so, many UK country teams, both in Whitehall and at Post, would claim to deliver comprehensively. And what this usually amounted to, in the best instances, were an articulation of HMG's objectives for that particular country in the form of a UK country strategy, which would be signed off by an ambassador or a high commissioner, and then the division of the responsibility for the objectives contained within that strategy would be allocated out to various different departments, each of whom would have their own staffing and funding streams, and they would deliver against those various different aims. Where there was collective funding streams utilised, such as the conflict pool that I mentioned earlier, these would also tend to be allocated departmentally. So despite there being collective funding at the strategic level, it was rare that those programmes were being delivered jointly. And at best, this would generate that collective approach at a strategic level, but then operational silos for delivery. And at worst, you would get to a stage where either strategies were simply developed on the totality of the activity, so bottom up, or they would end up yielding duplicatory or occasionally contradictory activity because of that siloed approach. There were notable exceptions to that over the period, the collective HMG security sector reform effort in Sierra Leone, the provincial reconstruction team in Helmand, and some of the work on recently in the security, justice and defence programme in Libya. But separation rather than integration tended to be the norm, and this was something that the coalition government were quite keen to challenge and change. So the intent behind the integrated approach, therefore, was there to be greater collective analysis, which led to more coherent strategy development, followed by better and stronger collective operational delivery of HMG objectives rather than departmental priorities delivered in those silos that I mentioned. And the implications of that were pretty profound at a policy level. It would no longer be sufficient, for example, for defence actors to deliver defence objectives in isolation, and where defence assets could make positive contributions to either diplomatic or developmental endeavours, these would be prioritised. Similarly, greater pressure was placed on development actors to ensure that within their mandates, if their efforts could contribute to wider HMG aims and objectives, that active consideration of that should take place, and that diplomats should enable the platform through which HMG's priority objectives be delivered, not simply promote diplomatic objectives rather than that collective HMG intent. And perhaps the best way of visualising this sort of pictorially is a shift away from terminology that we quite often use in terms of conflict prevention or stabilisation toolkits, which implies a series of different tools and approaches, to more of a Swiss Army knife approach to collective intervention, having all of those tools linked together in one place. And in recognition of the need for these institutions to align themselves better, the National Security Council, which in itself is a relatively new concept within British government terms, has slowly been asserting its authority by advocating for greater collective prioritisation, greater collective strategy making and resource allocation, and seeking to play a much more active role in this process than perhaps has been the case previously. And I'll come back to that a bit later in the presentation. So why integrate? The argument really is that, and again, common sense, collaboration is essential. No one individual department has the skills, experience, structures and systems to deliver the totality of HMG's objectives in fragile and conflict-affected states alone. Working in these environments is inherently political, so there's a requirement both the understanding of our politics as well as the politics of the host nation is essential. Many, certainly I can say from experience, of the entry points for work in such environments comes through effective defence engagement. Often there will be defence relationships that are far stronger and often can endure, particularly during times of conflict, than political or developmental relationships. And the work often requires a developmental programmatic approach to be sustainable in the longer term. So this has been described in some quarters as the 3D approach: defence, development and diplomacy. Though in reality, I think in our case in the UK, the increased focus on linking the domestic agenda to international instability means that we are now talking about a 4D approach, with a domestic fourth D being added. You could say that HMG is entering the fourth dimension in that regard. So how to integrate? If any government is going to be operating in such a manner, it needs tools and mechanisms to enable those constituent parts to think, plan, programme and deliver collectively. HMG operates under the assumption that by facilitating key stakeholders to think together, plan and strategise together and programme and deliver together on a set of issues of mutual interest, we hopefully will create a whole greater than the sum of its parts. However, I think this is something that we've experienced within the stabilisation unit, is that in addition to doing these things in operational contexts, it's quite important to promote a culture of integration outside of those operational imperatives to do so. So as a result, we place quite a lot of emphasis on creating enabling environments for HMG staff to learn together via lessons events, via training, via civilian input into military exercises and vice versa, which has the benefit of exposing HMG staff to that cross-HMG and civil military working in non-operational settings prior to that in-theatre exposure. And in terms of those vehicles designed to, I'll dwell on two, I think, in terms of the presentation. One is the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, a new mechanism that starts from 1st of April of next year, and the other is the Stabilisation Unit itself. So in terms of the Conflict Stability and Security Fund first, I think there's an added incentive to reinforce that integrated approach that our political masters are keen to focus on. In June 2013, the National Security Council agreed, and I quote, to reform decision-making processes around countries at risk of instability, creating a clearer strategic framework and better integrating our national capabilities and resources to address conflict and stability overseas. And in part, this was a recognition, I think, that despite those policy documents that I mentioned earlier from 2010 and 2011, there was certainly a strong feeling within the political community that the structures hadn't sufficiently adjusted at the speed that was expected to adapt to that new world in which we were working. In order to resource this ambition, the National Security Council agreed to increase the size and scope of the conflict pool, which amounts to about £220 million a year, that's accessible to the Foreign Office, DFID and the Ministry of Defence, to a £1 billion conflict stability and security fund that will commence from April of next year. That fund will basically, as well, I mean, the National Security Council were clear in their view that there appeared to be insufficient, I think, incentives to collaborate either within government or internationally, and that there was similarly a gap between international departments' levels of collaboration and integration and then the domestic environment. So as a result, there was a need to forge stronger relationships between defence development, diplomatic actors and that domestic security community has meant that whilst the pot of money has increased in size, the number of actors who can access that money has increased as well. So for the first time there is the potential for joint integrations between the Foreign Office, DFID and Ministry of Defence, but also the Home Office, the National Crime Agency, the Crown Prosecution Service and the Ministry of Justice, to name but a few. As well as the ability to access those resources, that collective community now have the ability to determine which countries the National Security Council will take an active interest in, as well as try and shape UK strategies for those countries. And the intent behind these reforms is to try and unify policy processes, strategy processes and resource allocation processes, but at the heart of it, I think, trying to create a more streamlined and less layered architecture, which ultimately will result in more direct connections between the NSC and its decision-making processes and the HMG strategy and spend on the ground. So the second mechanism by which to promote integration is the stabilisation unit, and I think, as I've already mentioned, we are a integrated civil military operation unit. Our purpose is to try and help HMG respond to crises and address the causes of instability overseas in an integrated manner, and we do that through using our in-house expertise and access to a wider database. As an integrated unit ourselves, we seek to practice what we preach and champion that integrated approach across government, and specifically, I think, try and ensure that some of the gains made over the last decade in terms of effective civil military working are not lost as a result of no immediate operational requirement to use them. I think we learnt some hard lessons from the Balkans experiences of the 1990s, but then some of that best practice wasn't then replicated in the decade to come. I think there's a serious danger that in the next decade that we don't end up losing some of the very painful lessons identified from Afghanistan and Iraq. And we aim to achieve this, as I mentioned, through to support doctrine revision and development, shaping and participating bilateral, multilateral and multinational increasingly exercises, generating lessons and providing effective operational support, the lessons on legs. We believe there are three main pillars of the integrated approach that require quite proactive shaping and support. They're shared understanding, the first, integrated structures and processes, the second, and as I've already alluded to, the promotion of an integrated culture through the establishment of relationships and cultural understanding between those departments. So elaborating briefly on each in turn, a common challenge in HMG's engagement in many fragile and conflict-affected states is that each department will have a different assessment of the problem and will have a different interest in resolving it. And we feel quite strongly that unless there is a collective understanding of what's happening in a country, what we're trying to do to address it, any form of integrated response is going to fail at the first hurdle. So working very closely with colleagues from DFID, the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence, we've been utilising a methodology called the Joint Analysis of Conflict and Stability, the JACS, which is a tool designed to promote a shared understanding of context and thus enabling the articulation of common aims and objectives which will help govern HMG's efforts in those conflict situations. And this isn't the first time, obviously, that HMG has had various forms of conflict assessment methodologies, but the emphasis in any JACS process is the J, the joint element of the methodology. So the idea is that any terms of reference to undertake these processes get to agreed across HMG, including implicitly the commitment to act upon the analysis and the recommendations that come out of this. To date, there's about 20 of these processes undertaken, and even where there hasn't been necessarily any programmatic recommendations to go forward. I think quite helpfully there have been certain cases in which the recommendations that have come out have generated not engaging because HMG's efforts would not necessarily be considered to be particularly helpful. They have proved, the process has proved quite a useful basis to support integrated planning, policy and resource allocation, and also has the benefit of bringing together a small community of people who might otherwise not necessarily meet each other quite regularly with a common interest in a particular country and the sharing and pooling of networks of access and influence in those countries. I think despite the progress made, though, there are some further work on joint analysis is still required. And as I mentioned before, as this new conflict stability and security fund starts, it's going to be quite important that as that aforementioned 3D approach expands to a 4th D, there's going to need to be thinking about how those domestic actors, the stakeholders and the interests that they have become accommodated within that analysis. And the flip side, I think, is some of those actors will obviously need to understand that how international engagement works, how diplomatic development and defence tools currently operate, rather than necessarily assuming that what one might be able to do in the UK is directly transferable overseas. I think there's also a need to try and think how JAC's process is factored better into military operational planning. There's an element of a silo still there, and that the current methodology works more effectively for longer term engagement rather than just be used for short term crisis response. Secondly, the integrated approach, in order to succeed, there is that need to continue to develop and refine structures and processes to help the alignment of activity in conflict situations. And as I mentioned, despite the improvements in strategy and analysis, the majority of delivery in fragile and conflict affected states is decided upon and delivered departmentally rather than jointly. The dangers of this approach, as we've seen in places like South Sudan, is the potential for groupthink within individual departments. People want a certain thing to happen, so therefore they assume that it will. And the risk that opportunities for synergy between defence, development and diplomatic activities get missed through a focus on one's own business and the lack of awareness of the activities of others. As I mentioned, I think there's been a noticeable shift in the past couple of years to the co-location of HMG assets in fragile contexts, which is welcome. Again, it sounds like a statement of the obvious, but if people are eating, working and socialising together, then you will get a more integrated approach. But for quite a long time there was a big push for individual departments to be located separately, which is being addressed now. And I think there is a situation whereby by having a sizable increase in programmatic resources that the CSSF will bring, there will be a need to think about how departments collectively spend those resources, rather than assuming that each of them can absorb quite significant additional sums of money on their own. But I think there is still a need to try and promote that operational integration that I was talking about. And I think trying, although it's challenging, thinking about how defence assets such as peace support teams, military assistance and training teams might engage with these integrated structures will be key to ensuring that defence actors shape development and diplomatic activity and vice versa. And I think the integration of the Defence Advisory Team in Libya into a wider security and justice and defence programme and the metamorphosis of the International Military Advisory Training Team in Sierra Leone into an International Security Advisory Team that is included civilians, police officers, etc., are providing, I think, excellent blueprints for how that more integrated operational structure will work. And finally, I think there's a need to try and ensure that in many ways in peacetime, to use inverted commas, integration becomes standard practice rather than be seen as something that's only appropriate in times of crisis. We currently deliver as the Stabilisation Unit the cross-HMG conflict and stabilisation and security and justice training, and as well as delivering quite valuable learning objectives, it has the added benefit of allowing staff both across HMG and from outside HMG to develop networks, build relationships with staff that they may not usually engage with, and just hear some very, very different opinions of the world, how the world operates, how actors, both governmental and non-governmental, engage with it, and to try and broaden people's thinking away from the more traditional supply-driven approaches. We find that forming a stronger understanding of departmental nomenclature, structures, cultures and ways of working is quite critical for the integrated approach to prove effective. And a combination of both soft and hard power, I suppose, sort of lessons, seminars, tendencies of military exercises, training opportunities and planning processes, is slowly building a group of staff over the last decade or so that are both cognizant of the skills required to work departmentally, but also have opportunities to develop and demonstrate their prowess in this regard. I think a positive from within the military is, as we draw down from current operations, there's more capacity and appetite within the military for exercise scenarios that involve more integrated responses, where the military are plugging into civilian-led activity rather than the other way round. But we remain, certainly within the SU, concerned that without that immediacy of current operations to drive these opportunities, there is a danger that the civilian community will become less willing and less keen to plug into these structures and systems. And I think there's a need for both groups really to compromise here. I think military exercises seeking civilian input needs to be better prioritised, not series of ad hoc requests. The relevant scenarios need to really reflect lightly operational realities rather than Finland invading Poland or wherever it might be. The civilian roles within those exercises need to be much more defined and realistic. Departments in turn, I think, Foreign Office, MOD, DFID in particular, need to recognise the utility of those opportunities and enable and empower staff with an interest and an appetite to work on and in fragile and conflict-affected states to attend them. I think certainly from when I first started this work, I'm quite pleased we're moving out of an era in which exercise planners asked for an FCO or a DFID and actually now a bit more nuanced in terms of the skill sets that they require for those individuals. But it's also quite important that I think that HMG, particularly given unprecedented crisis at the moment, continues to encourage and make available people with prior experience of cross-departmental working. This is really something ideally we don't want people to be learning on the job. This type of work is difficult enough. So in terms of some of the issues and challenges then associated with integration, there's been a lot of work done within the academic community on whole of government analysis, and I'll just pick one to quote from Patrick and Brown that noted that improved communication, common resource pools and coordination mechanisms can improve policy response, but it's no substitute for a clear, agreed upon strategic framework reflecting common priorities. I have to admit to being quite pleasantly surprised, being sort of naturally sceptical about some of this stuff, as to the appetite for collaboration in the last couple of years across HMG since the launch of that Building Stability Overseas strategy I mentioned, but particularly at the strategic level. As I mentioned earlier, we've facilitated over 20 joint analysis of conflict and stability processes. The NSC requirement to produce cross-government strategies agreed by all of the different departments for priority fragile and conflict-affected states is leading to an increased appetite and delivery of cross-government planning, which is welcome. And there's been some increased appetite for collective programming, particularly on security and justice issues, which is welcome, and a welcome recognition of the fact that each department's got something to offer, but none own the totality of it. There has been an increase in the scoping, design and monitoring and evaluation of joint programmes in places like Libya, Somalia, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, to name but a few. And there are some very active design processes taking place now in advance of this fund in places like Pakistan and Yemen that are throwing up some fairly uncomfortable but I think very positive discussions across government around where policies may be slightly contradictory or where they need to be better aligned or better clarified. But despite these signs of progress, I think it would be complacent to assume that integration has become the norm within government. It's apparent that the application of the integrated approach is not easy. It requires compromise, for one. It requires the melding of different institutional cultures, different timeframes, different language, and different levels of appetite. There do remain some very significant institutional and organisational obstacles to overcome in order for this to be second nature. And I'll outline a few of these before some suggestions for addressing them. It's been argued by a couple of people, Mark Etherington, one who's worked very closely with the Stabilisation Unit, but also out in various different multilateral fora, currently one of the deputy heads of the OSCE mission in Ukraine, that the integrated approach is flawed in four key areas of execution. The first is a lack of strategic expertise at the centre. The second is a cultural barrier in that departments resist advice from outsiders who are not necessarily familiar with their modus operandi and don't particularly want those new knowledge and skills if they're not immediate to the needs of the department. The third is structurally through the lack of an overarching authority that's able to take a holistic overview of what a priority is, recognise deficiencies and correct them. And fourthly, a problematic civil-military relationship, which is often exacerbated by that aforementioned lack of government oversight and incentive to work jointly. Major General Gordon Messenger, who will be known to many of you as well, taking it into the multilateral sphere, saw this as problematic, the lack of international ownership of the non-military effort in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, the difference in time horizons between departments. Some departments take a very short-term view of the world through to others who take perhaps an excessively longer-term view. That can cause tension. The sheer scale of the military effort and the planning capability, which dwarfs that of the civilian sector, adds a challenge in terms of influence. And the difference in departmental geographical focus. So a good example of that would have been, at the time this was written about 2007, Afghanistan and Iraq taking up about 80% of the MOD's attention, while for DFID, Africa remained the biggest priority. And obviously the Foreign Office has to maintain a global oversight. And the other point that he made was the differences in hierarchy, the very fact that there are much fewer layers in civilian structures, and that a civilian there isn't really a civilian operational level in the same way that there is within the military, which often creates additional problems. So how to address some of these challenges? I think almost one of the reasons for giving this talk in many ways is I think probably the first challenge for us all is redefining the lexicon and articulating the concept. I think if you were having this conversation within NATO, the EU or the UN, there would be discussions around member states and that body about whether we're comprehensive or whether we're integrated. There's a need for that terminology to be standardised and commonly understood in the first instance by all parties within HMG. I think then you would extend that into wider approaches within the UK and obviously within the multinational community. And a good starting point, therefore, would be to try and develop some of the work that's already been done by the military rather than reinvent the wheel, who have a glossary of agreed and defined terms as the basis for that joint doctrine I mentioned. I think many of those are in use across Whitehall and more widely, but there would be a need, obviously, to recalibrate and assume and challenge where necessary. And following on from that identified need for more precisely agreed language to describe how the departments and agencies work together, there's also a need to articulate more precisely what is meant by the integrated approach itself. I've illustrated how the terminology might be changed and why here, but there is still very limited material regarding when an integrated approach is necessary, when it might not be appropriate, and what success looks like in terms of that integration. And this isn't just a UK problem. There's a range of interpretations of the concept in both the multinational community and the multilateral community. And I'd venture that as the need for closer and perhaps more complex integration is driven by a more complex view of the world and a more complex view of prevention, as James alluded to, I think there's very much a need to articulate more clearly what we mean and intend by the concept, and this becomes more and more pressing. I think having had that slightly more conceptual stroke semantic debate, there's then a better need to define the doctrine, and as the integration of planning and delivery becomes more commonplace across HMG and other actors, so the requirement and the acceptance of the need for some guidance or doctrine is growing. There's a need to understand better what integration means at the various levels of planning, what departments and agencies contribute, and how to define what needs to be done jointly versus what needs to be done separately. For a long time, the doctrine of civil-military relationships has served as the basis, but I think it's certainly a personal view for me that there are some quite significant complexities in terms of civil relationships that suggest that being clear about the difference between developmental, diplomatic, domestic, etc. needs to be developed further. And I think there is a need as part of that process, and the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund provides an opportunity to do this, to be much clearer about measuring the effectiveness of integration, what is good practice and has it been achieved or not. I think operationally there's a need to enhance the incentive structures for cross-government collaboration, both civil-military and civil-civil, as I mentioned. And I think it's probably not unfair to say that whilst the pressure remains politically to integrate standard civil service career paths, place limited emphasis on delivering upon anybody's objectives other than your own. Speaking probably only slightly with my tongue in my cheek, the sort of this Humphrey mentality of ascendancy through preserving one's own resources at the expense of others still remains, and for integration to retain traction operationally, there's a clear need to incentivise it and then measure that incentive. The good news, I think, is that's entirely doable, and it's beginning to happen. I think it simply involves ensuring that senior managers and owners' objectives are not only set and assessed by their own departments, but instead objectives and performance are assessed cross-departmentally. The emphasis now placed on integration by our National Security Council should act as an additional incentive for those seeking to climb that greasy pole if career paths are incentivised in that regard. And there's going to be more than enough jobs that will sit across government in the future, I venture. So, and in terms of the next steps then, I mean, all of these areas of work will require clear leads and champions within Whitehall, back to the gap that I mentioned earlier in terms of the lack of a champion body, a point of contact for this work. There's a need to link this clearly into that existing work, MOD, Futures Studies, Cabinet Office Horizon Scanning, and a mechanism called the Integrated Approach Working Group. But the degree to which the integrated approach is formalised is largely dependent upon departmental appetites at the end of the day, and the requirement to coordinate across Whitehall response in a crisis or a potential crisis tends to rest with our Cabinet Office. So given that our National Security Council is now well practised at integration at Cabinet level, and that's accepted as a norm, I think it's probably likely that sitting underneath that within the Cabinet Office there's probably a need to try and empower the integrated approach and use it as a tool to affect the implementation of that policy. And it goes without saying that as well as doing this within our own system, we need to continue to think about how we develop thinking with allies and partners on this. Probably just by finalising in terms of conclusions, I think probably one of the things I was quite keen to emphasise as well is that it's important to say that it's not the case that if only we get our own house in order and get our own tools right that we will automatically succeed. I think having spent a decade or so working on this stuff myself, I think it's pretty clear that there are no magic bullets in this process, and that stabilisation and state building work is difficult, it's prone to recurrent failure and reversion to violence, and the specific context and the understanding in which one is working are paramount to generate the right responses and solutions. So I think whilst it is desirable to improve our own systems, improve our own cross-government integration and coordination and coherence, both within ourselves and within the international community, I think we really need to avoid falling into that trap of taking a sort of mechanical metaphor of state failure, which tends to treat failed states very much like broken machines, which can be repaired by good mechanics. I think that metaphor is naturally seductive in the sense that it suggests that both the right tools and technocratic approaches can generate solutions to state failure. I think they can't. It ignores the primacy of the local politics, the political economy, and the vested interests of the local elites, and how I think in some instances a failed state serves very much in the interest of many within that country and within the wider region and the political economy. So I think ultimately that mechanical metaphor of state building and by its extension stabilisation overlooks that centrality of the informal networks of power and the authority that are sometimes supported by those wartime economies and the political networks, along with those coping strategies of the populace. So I think it's whilst clearly we need to improve getting our own house in order and getting our own integrated structures and systems together, we need to recognise that those better tools or structures will not lead automatically to better outcomes, and sometimes we need to accept that our engagement might often be the least bad option rather than necessarily generate a positive outcome. So, in conclusion, integration is not easy, it's resource intensive, it involves compromise, and it involves the need to adapt approaches to suit wildly differing institutional cultures and incentives, both within our own systems and within the environments in which we're trying to work. Despite this, I think the benefits of fully utilising those tools and approaches we have at our disposal within government and within the international community clearly outweigh the challenges. This stuff is difficult enough without having to fight our own systems and structures. So it's equally clear, I think, that the political appetite and imperative for integration is not going to abate. It will only get stronger, particularly in the current resource environment. And there are some good positive steps taking place within government to deliver on that political direction given. I think our structures and systems are constantly evolving, and I hope that our experience over the past decade will lay those foundations that will strengthen the conflict architecture and try and incorporate those domestic actors as they play an increasing role. I think that our efforts need to integrate, need to be expanded both to them and to that wider international conflict architecture in which we'll continue to play a significant role. So that was all I was going to say, James, and I know there's a lot there. Happy to answer questions, comments, take views.
Thanks, Mark. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, discussion. So if you'd like to catch my eye, just raise your hand and give your name and affiliation. First to Adam Roberts.
Could you say a word about some of the international dimensions of your work in particular, how much emphasis is placed, if any, on collaboration with the UN body that was established a few years ago? How much emphasis is placed on NATO, whether similar thinking is going on in other NATO countries, and etc. which?
Yeah.
And likewise, further afield. For example, have we had much contact with Japan on these issues? And perhaps I could add as a naughty PS to that question. How strongly do you feel the need for improved understanding of languages of the countries?
No, absolutely. Shall I take them in
Yeah,
turn? Or, yeah. Okay. So, no, just to take that one. I mean, there is very much an international dimension to our work. I think both multinationally and multilaterally. I think obviously the policy relationships with UN, EU, NATO, and obviously other bilateral countries remains with our stabilisation unit's parent departments, mainly the Foreign Office, DFID, and Ministry of Defence. But I think the last 10 years or so has thrown up a whole body of not dissimilar bodies to the stabilisation unit. So within the American system, the Canadian system, the Australians, Dutch, Danes, Germans, and French. Each of those have interdepartmental bodies that are designed in many ways to deliver that integrated approach. As I talked about in the presentation, some of them call that different things. Some of them call it the comprehensive approach, some the integrated approach, some whole of government approaches, but they broadly sort of amount to the same recognition of the need to combine those different tools. There's an element, as you would imagine, not quite of a parallel structure and system, but often what will tend to happen when our government gets involved in a particular crisis or a particular intervention in a country, that in parallel to the networks that are established diplomatically or developmentally, the stabilisation unit will be talking to our sister organisations about what it is that their governments are either intending to do, might do, want to do. We try wherever possible to share pieces of analysis in recognition that there are certain governments who have much more developed analytical capacities in certain countries, depending on their historical relationships with them, and the more some of that information can be shared, the better. And we try wherever possible to develop joint programmatic engagements as well. Some of that is affected by politics. I don't think it's any secret to anyone in this room that there will be certain places where individual governments or multilateral bodies will very much want to be seen to be doing something under their own auspices, but the more that information is shared, the better. I think there's then a second level in terms of the second part of your question. There are quite a lot of countries that don't have these mechanisms who are now becoming increasingly interested in this type of joined up working. So you mentioned the Japanese. We have had a series of conversations with the Japanese who have quite a strong crisis response mechanism, but that doesn't then extend into conflict prevention around how they can better utilise their defence and development and diplomatic assets together as they become more interested in engaging not only in the humanitarian or disaster relief responses, but getting more involved in prevention. There was quite a significant interest from from some other European countries, Sweden, Norway, in developing this type of capacity. And interestingly, I think in recent times, they're very nascent. There's quite a lot of interest within the Chinese government around also how they might develop more integrated approaches to peacekeeping. So there's quite a lot of these conversations that are ongoing. We tend in the SU to keep them at the operational level rather than get involved in that policy community, but clearly link up to the policy. Your final question is absolutely spot on, and I think we maintain that a key part of understanding knowledge and the cultural nuances of operating environments is having the right language skills. I think that within government often it presents some, I think to be frank, quite frustrating difficulties in the fact that often the people who will have the most detailed knowledge and understanding of the context will only be able to do so much work within the British government because of our own security architecture. But certainly through the stabilisation unit's database that I mentioned, we've got I couldn't put a precise figure on it, but a whole raft of nationalities and languages for people that we can draw upon for specific tasks. I would hope, and I know that the former Foreign Secretary and the current Foreign Secretary were both very passionate about this as well, is that a key part of establishing diplomatic excellence is making sure that we have the language skills and the cultural understanding to go with it.
Just building on that,
Yeah,
how far then do you work with local partners abroad who might have that expertise, both not just in linguistic terms, but also local politics, local culture that expatriate staff or foreign nationals who learn the language might just lack?
No, it's a very good question. I think it's, to be frank, it's probably patchy depending on various different parts of the world. So I think within Africa there's a relatively strong relationship, particularly in terms of the security and justice work that we do. We have actually a strategic partnership with an entity called the African Security Sector Network, who we utilise to draw upon specific African expertise in terms of the design of security and justice interventions. Often, and I can speak from personal experience, having been involved with quite a few of these, the knowledge and experience that people provide, and indeed the access that they can generate is something that goes well beyond anything that anyone from the UK or any other Western country can generate. And I can remember two of these, having people who'd been through the Sierra Leone security sector reform process speaking to their South Sudanese counterparts was far more powerful than anybody coming from the UK and presenting that as a theory. Similarly, I think trying to generate greater regional collaboration between Anglophone and Francophone nations, which whilst they have very different security structures and systems, have a lot of commonality in terms of culture, is also again a much more powerful message than sending a police officer from the UK or a retired military officer or whatever it might be. I think within the South Asia, I suppose, sort of region, there has been, I think, some attempts to facilitate this. I think it's been a bit more patchy across different departments. I think it's something that DFID are much more willing to embrace as part of their design processes. I think perhaps it's something that happens a bit less on the defence side of the world. On the Foreign Office side, obviously, there's very much the utilisation of staff within embassies who obviously are recruited on the basis of their knowledge and networks. So personal views, I'd say there's more that can be done in that space. And I think part of the challenge, which I didn't really touch upon in the presentation, but I think is important, is going to be trying to align in many ways an increased focus within our own political economy on results, on impact, on effectively producing documentation that stands up to scrutiny to our own accountability networks, with the fact that there will be a lot of people in the countries in which we work who don't tend to think that way, but at the same time have far more knowledge and understanding of the nuances of what can and should be done. And it's about fusing, I think, those two skill sets together.
We've got a growing list, so maybe we'll take groups of two.
Of course, yeah.
Gentleman by the mirror and then Paul Holton.
Yes, Craig Holton, member of the double overall list. Thank you very much, Mark, for that very useful overview you gave us. Two brief questions. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the role of the NSC in all of this, and as a practitioner in the system, how you see some of the pros and cons about that role as a lead agency. And you mentioned methodology, joint methodology and analysis, and I think enumerated now over 20 of these JACs that have come out. And I wonder if you could say a few words about the phenomenon that's called JACs Light, which to some of us in the field seems like a contradiction in terms that it doesn't seem to encourage a strategic long-term approach, but it is more like a cigarette packet. Are those a thing of the past, or do they still have a role as part of the joint analysis?
Yeah, questions.
So, no, we take Paul's.
Yeah.
Paul Holton, Coventry University. I love the way that we think we were getting the 3Ds working together. We had a fourth dimension, but I really wanted to pick up on, rather than reflecting on sort of the internal dynamics, you started touching upon a moment ago in using your approach with other countries, with the fragile states and also with partners. And I'm just quite interested in how you manage that relationship with fragile and conflict-affected states, where your entry point might be Ministry of Defence, but your analysis might suggest that there's other areas in which the intervention is most pressing. And I guess the second question, a cheeky one from me, and my interest on the arms transfer side of things, is the UK government's decision to directly supply arms to armed actors such as Peshmerga. To my mind, it is a change in terms of policy and decisions in this field. Is it an exceptional case, or is it potentially going to be within your analyses other risky cases such as Nigeria and Boko Haram or other West African cases where you could consider this? Whereas in the past, normally the decisions, as far as I could understand, was the UK might support that or turn a blind eye. but will we be looking at directly intervening with arms trading in a way that perhaps we haven't in the past?
No, good questions. Or shall I respond to those now? Okay, so maybe starting with yours, Craig. I think the NSC is very much a work in progress. So I think it's probably fair to say that statement I quoted in 2013 was probably the first time that the teeth of the NSC, if you will, were bared in terms of changes that they wanted to make in the process. I think probably on the pro side, the positive side, I think it's actually quite welcome that ministers now, probably for the first time, have been presented with some really quite challenging policy decisions and being highlighted with the opportunity costs of making those decisions. So I think clearly, whilst £1 billion sounds the new Conflict Stability Security Fund, whilst it sounds like a large amount of money, and of course it is, when you take away the assessed contributions to UN peacekeeping, that takes out quite a sizable chunk of it. When you look at the fact that a lot of the money within that fund is not necessarily nominally earmarked for activity, but quite a large amount of that is classified or needs to be classified as official development assistance. That limits further what the options that can be used to utilise it, and the very fact that you have more actors wishing to get their slice of the cake means that you could argue almost that you've created a greater level of pressure for those resources than the amount of money that existed previously that was much smaller. Certainly from what I've seen, I think placing some pressure both on the NSC to much more clearly and much more consistently articulate their priorities is a good thing. I think making sure that they are aware that by making a decision, that decision has consequences, and you can't be interested in a country for a week. If you decide that something is important and you articulate it's important, that commits you for a period of time that then you need to accept. If something more important comes afterwards, then the opportunity cost has already been made. And I think probably going back to one of the former questions, for me one of the positives is also asking some really good questions about should the UK really be doing this. You know, this country might be important, but it doesn't automatically follow that the UK is therefore the best actor to engage in that issue. And I think a combination of more finite resources plus a greater, for want of a better term, waterfront overview of who else is doing what, which is also part of the process, may hopefully encourage a few more decisions that says this country is important, but actually it's far better for the United Nations to lead in terms of this, or the European Union, or whoever it might be. So I think they're the positives. I think some of the cons of the process is, and these are perhaps statements of the obvious, is that the danger of making the allocations far more politically driven is the fact that may on occasion lend far more short-term responses. The need to be seen to be doing something, which with a finite pot of money is difficult. I think personal view, the very fact that and this is beginning to change, much of the focus is on countries, loses, I think, the subtlety of quite a lot of the work that we engage in collectively as international community is often regional in nature, and therefore that whilst a certain country may not necessarily be as high on the UK's agenda as most, it may be that region is a region of interest, and we need to look a bit more collectively at the issue. And I think probably extending that point, one of the other dangers of looking at issues on a country-by-country basis, as we've seen, for example, within the Middle East, is that if success is addressing a challenge in a particular country and moving the challenge somewhere else, then to a certain extent you run the risk of operational success at the risk of strategic failure. So I think thinking a bit more about how issues like small arms, policing, etc., can be thought about thematically rather than just cut up cookie style in terms of the countries in which they are relevant are important. In terms of your second question about the JACS and the JACS Lite, that goes back to something I probably touched upon briefly but didn't elaborate on, is the different appetite and aptitude between different departments when it comes to planning. I think it won't be a surprise to anyone in this room. There is a sliding scale, perhaps, from the defence community who plan extensively for a myriad of options, through to perhaps the diplomatic community who are continually analysing and assessing, but don't necessarily tend to adopt or support formal planning processes in the way that perhaps DFID and the MOD do. The JACS Lite was in many ways a sort of a compromise to that, the recognition that it was very important to have everybody on board under the J piece, and if what needed to happen therefore was something a bit more light touch, then therefore it was better in the interest of a joint approach to accommodate that. I suspect, though, in terms of your question, the very fact that there is so much more pressure now than perhaps there was to articulate clearly HMG's strategic intent in a country, and given that one of the best ways of doing that is on the basis of some robust analysis as to what are the issues, drivers and tensions within that country, therefore I would hope that these processes will over time become more comprehensive, because there will be a requirement to do so. In terms of your questions, Paul, I'm not sure I quite understood the first one. Was in terms of your first question, was it around how we collectively engage internationally, or
it's basically that while you might get your integration together on this side, I'm just wondering how that's sort of received on the other end. And
yes.
How you're finding your partners.
Yes, right,
in
understood.
In some cases, you go in because the Ministry of Defence is the opening.
Yes.
And there's someone on the other side, a general scratching his head about why someone from DFID is in the room.
Yes,
so
no, absolutely. No, very.
Issues, I guess, was the follow-on.
No, understood. No, very good question. I mean, I think it's basically it is mixed. I think there is still a challenge in which clearly each of those different HMG actors that are operating in the country tend to have their own relationships that are developed often on a one-to-one basis or a departmental basis. And as a result, often there is a need to do some groundwork in explaining to the recipients in that country concerned as to why HMG has taken that approach. I mean, just to give you a practical example, somewhere like Ethiopia, whereby DFID had for quite a long time been engaged in various different security and justice initiatives for various different reasons, largely around the management of the relationship with Ethiopia. Those programs had started and stopped, I think, for very good reasons. And there was a need, in order for DFID to re-engage for, I think, the third time, for some of those relationships to be explained in terminology that some of those Ethiopian government stakeholders would understand by diplomatic and defence actors rather than necessarily development actors. I think in Nigeria, again, I think that was quoted by somebody else earlier, again, I think it is often in countries where those civil-military relationships may not always be as strong. Sometimes, again, it is important to ensure that the right person delivers the right message. But I think the key piece from an HMG perspective is that that message is agreed internally, collectively, so regardless of who is delivering the message is the same. So I think sometimes there's an element of recognising that different environments require different approaches, but it's just being clear that operationally everyone is on the same page rather than necessarily purely delivering their own departmental agendas. On your third question, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's going to be one that there's going to be an element of wait and see. I think certainly I can reassure you that these decisions aren't taken lightly, and I think that what tends to happen in terms of those recommendations that ultimately will be decided by political actors, quite a lot of emphasis, particularly from the Foreign Office and indeed from defence and development actors, is placed on some of those opportunity costs and consequences. One of the things I can say from personal experience, having been quite involved in some of the Libya work, is that the quality of the paperwork that goes up to the NSC is now infinitely better than it was 2 to 3 years ago. It's still not brilliant, I'm not going to tell any lies about that, but whereas in the past often there might be something that said, do you want to do this, yes or no, and that's always a dangerous question to ask a politician. Being able to say, if you do this, here are some of the benefits and here are some of the drawbacks and here are some of the short, longer term and medium term consequences, plus here's what you will need to think about in terms of delivering it, which is a bit where we tend to come in. That process is a lot more nuanced. So as the NSC is developing its capabilities, in many ways the architecture designed to support it is doing the same thing. So yeah, I mean, I'm conscious that's a slight fudge. I genuinely don't know the answer, but I would say that it's not. I would be very, very surprised if this was suddenly going to become the norm.
We're nearly up against time, so we'll take 3 final questions, if you can keep the questions short. Lord Ramsbottom, I'm not sure if you had one. Then the gentleman in the middle row, and then Olivia Bosch.
Thank you very much for what you've said. I've recently been a member of the House of Lords Select Committee on Soft Power, and one of the recommendations we made was that the lack of integration in Afghanistan was something that really needed to be gone into and examined. And I'm now a member of the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy, and we're looking very hard at the production of a national security strategy to underpin
the 2015 SDSR in a way that didn't happen in 2010. And one of the reasons for this is making absolutely certain that there is a proper integrated approach, but also a statement of the national self-interest, which you mentioned about the national policy being abundantly clear. So is the UK the best actor? And I wondered really whether it would help you improve the integration if we made a major representation about integration in the report that we subsequently put out about the security strategy.
No, it's a good question. Shall I take that one now? Or
No, we
we'll
just
do the three and then we'll,
Two quick questions. First, if you could tell us a little bit about the impact of the challenges of integration, embedding integration on upstream prevention. Now, much of what you've talked about, much of it has come out about outcomes and the need to demonstrate impact, almost points towards short-termism. What's the impact of embedding integration on upstream prevention? The second one, because I'm from Child Soldiers International, is about child soldiers. I mean, the BSOS and other aspects of policy at the moment really don't give that, in our view, due weight. Is the advent of 4D, the NSC and CSSF, and given what's going on in the world generally in terms of radicalisation of young people, recruitment of children, is that likely to change the focus at all, or sort of give it more weight than it's had in the past?
And Olivia?
Yes. One anecdote when a country was receiving assistance from a big donor, and there were multiple, as you indicated, there were multiple offices. There's the military department, foreign affairs, a different justice, whatever. And the country actually felt very upset because they thought that country didn't trust them. That they felt they needed these multiple entities to check up on. And I found myself in the position to have to explain, no, it's just the way the allocation occurs, basically, because often a lot of the aid allocation is delivered in silos because the big donor countries, that's how we've been structured for so long to do that. And the related to that is some small countries have said, we want your assistance, but you're a big country, they have 6 different deliverers for assistance. We're a small country, we are already thinking across government. So there was a need to try to streamline. Question, in the NSC, you mentioned the monitoring of what else everyone else is doing, because sometimes a small, discrete, let's say legislative writing project can be done very well by one entity, and very discreetly done, and that's good, independent. Sometimes you need a civil service management training, which maybe requires more across the board. So is it increasingly so that it's the NSC or the SU that monitors what not only UK is doing, but what other countries are doing, so that then people can organize the assistance of delivery? Because let's say it is good sometimes to have separate, non-integrated, get too much that way, and you forget that a lot of things goes sacredly. And a lot comes from working with Security Council resolution.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so just to take the questions in turn, then I think in terms of the joint committee and the underpinning for future strategy, I think I'd venture that I think the understanding of the conceptual understanding of why integration is important is broadly there now, and I think politically there is a huge sort of weight behind the need for that integrated response across governments. You'll be familiar with the reforms that are taking place in the civil service, the 1HMG initiatives, etc. I mean, without paraphrasing Tony Blair's education, I think now it would be sort of integration. I would venture, though, that the challenge will not be at the strategic level, it will be at that operational level. And the point that I made in the presentation around the fact that within civilian structures, the assumption within military institutions and certainly more security institutions full stop is that you have a clear hierarchy, and if a direction is set from the top, then that filters through the organisation. I don't think it's probably unfair to say that the record within civilian organisations is a bit more patchy in that regard. That operational layer doesn't exist in the same formal way. So I think that because this work is time consuming, because this work is resource intensive. To elaborate on some of the other questions, finding out what other people are doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, etc., all takes up time and effort. I think encouraging people to think about some of the resource implications of integration would be important, because certainly I can say from our perspective we are already seeing that the appetite to engage in some of those military exercises, to engage in the shaping of doctrine, etc., is going down. And that is largely as a result of people not being able to see perhaps the immediate benefit to them of doing it in a way that they could in previous crisis environments. Your question about the upstream piece, I think, is a really important one. Again, I would venture, perhaps slightly controversially, that there is a sliding scale of integration. So in places where people have to integrate and where they do live together, work together, eat together, etc., whilst they might still have very different backgrounds and incentives, there is a much more collegiate, collaborative approach. That is very much in stark contrast perhaps to places whereby traditionally HMG is engaged very separately, and there will be a defence relationship, a development relationship and a diplomatic relationship. It's an obvious point, but some of those countries that perhaps were relatively stable 2 or 3 years ago are becoming increasingly unstable, but HMG is perhaps not integrating as fast as the fragility in that country is creating, and having to start all of this stuff from scratch in a particular place is a problem. So again, I mean, I know I've used it already, but it's, I think, a particularly pertinent example for me was what happened in South Sudan, where it was pretty clear that the country was degenerating into a very fragile situation. There was quite a lot, I don't think it's unfair to say, not just from the UK, from the wider international community, there was quite a lot of resistance to accepting the reality of what was happening, and quite a lot of insistence in continuing to adopt the various different separate strategies that are being pursued. The problem, of course, then comes that when the time of crisis hits, it's much harder to try and bring everything together if it's been operationally siloed. So I would say that there's probably two things. I think number one is there is an importance to continue to emphasise the importance of not only responding effectively in crisis, but also devoting time and effort to places that are becoming increasingly unstable. That's at a more of a policy analytical level, but also trying to ensure that the best practice and the lessons indeed from integrated approaches in crisis situations become the norm in non-crisis situations, which I think there's more work to be done on. I think within, in terms of your second question on child soldiers, I think it's an interesting one. I think that at the moment it is one of the factors that is looked at within the joint assessments of conflict and instability, joint assessments of conflict stability, the JACS processes. But one of the things that we're conscious of, and I think another issue that, just to use as an example, is also in and around gender, where again we feel that there are certain aspects of particular society that are not being looked at as rigorously as they should within these methodologies. So I think I would say that still much will depend slightly in terms of the context in which the analysis is being undertaken and some of the people who are undertaking that analysis, but certainly it is an issue that's factored into the thinking, and obviously by virtue of that then the responses. I think the final question, I suppose the first part of your comment, I very much agree. I mean, I think having worked in a fair few places now that have quite small governments and quite limited capacity, the transaction costs of multiple actors working not always to the same purpose from the international community is huge. I've been in countries where you feel genuinely sorry for actually quite competent and quite able decision makers who spend their entire day basically dealing with the international community at the expense of doing their jobs, and often then have to do their jobs in the evenings. But in terms of your specific question around the assessments around what everybody else is doing, it works at two levels at the moment, and I think, again, personally, probably more could be done. It's a work in progress. So what currently happens is on the basis of, or what will happen, given this is the first year that this new process is running through, is that you will end up effectively with the countries in question and what this particular fund is proposing to support and a financial allocation. But rather than being asked to make a decision about whether that allocation sounds about right or not in isolation, ministers will be presented with an overview of what other bits of the British government are doing in that country. So what is DFID doing, if it's doing anything bilaterally, what is the MOD or the Foreign Office doing, but then also issues like, is there a large UN peacekeeping mission there? What is the extent of the UN programme? What are the EU doing? What are NATO doing? Or the OSCE, etc.? So, to be frank with you, I don't think it's going to be perfect at that strategic level, in the sense that perhaps wrongly people are assuming that money is the lever, and in many cases it's not. As you were alluding to, it's not what you're doing, it's how much of it you're doing, it's whether what you're doing is important and being done in the right way. So at that level, at least, there will be an oversight which should, I would hope, provoke a few more questions as to why is it that we are doing, or you're advocating a large programme from the UK when there is a very large UN mission or a very large US programme, whatever it might be. So at least there's some scrutiny there. I think, as I said, at that operational level, I can reassure you that certainly in the higher priority countries, there is now quite a lot of effectively sharing of information around, the sense that it doesn't make sense for two people to do the same thing. It's, none of us have got the money or the time to do that. But also, I think a recognition that there are certain countries that have real comparative advantages in certain thematic areas, both in terms of the perception of that country being involved, but also both in terms of their expertise. So that is happening more than it used to. I think probably more still could be done, would be my view.
Well, we'll end it there. Thanks very much, Mark. I think it's been a very rich discussion, a very rich presentation, and also the question and answer session I think was very valuable. I mean, I won't try and summarise anything, of course. I mean, people will be able to listen to the full talk online. But I would just like to say that I think this is one of the first of these sort of events that the Institute is doing, trying to bring in communities into the ISS that we haven't often heard from before, not just you at the nexus, the crossover of security and development, but people from the NGO community, humanitarians, others involved in SSR, DDR. And I can say that because I won't be the person doing a lot of it. That'll be Virginia Kamali, who's the Institute's new Research Fellow for Security and Development, sitting in the front row there. And I invite you to say hello to Virginia after this, so we can start to really develop this program a bit more. But I also hope we'll, again, welcome back SU speakers, maybe to talk about some of the more operational and programmatic aspects of work, deployed work. But before closing, just join me in thanking Mark for his talk today.